Okay, good morning, everyone. This is the public workshop for the CEQA guidelines update. So if you're looking for a different topic, you're in the wrong room. But I am Chris Calfee. I'm Senior Counsel at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. To my right, we have Holly Roberson, who is Land Use Counsel at the Office of Planning and Research. And to my left, we have Heather Baugh, who is Assistant General Counsel at the Natural Resources Agency. So thank you very much for joining us in person. And for those who are on webcast, thank you as well. Let's start with a little bit of background on why we're here today. For most folks in the room, you're familiar with the California Environmental Quality Act. That law requires that public agencies study the potential environmental impacts of their proposed projects, and if those impacts may be significant, to mitigate them or consider project alternatives. CEQA is contained in the Public Resources Code. In addition to the Public Resources Code, there are regulations that implement CEQA, and those are known as the CEQA guidelines. Those are contained in the California Code of Regulations, and they apply to public agencies and guide their implementation of the statute. The CEQA guidelines are developed first at OPR, and then they are ultimately adopted by the Natural Resources Agency following an administrative rulemaking process. The statute requires that the guidelines be reviewed every 2 years, and OPR is to consider potential updates. In recent years, however, the legislature has directed very specific updates, and so there hasn't been a comprehensive update to the guidelines since the late 90s. Because the CEQA guidelines are regulations, it's important to note that the guidelines must be consistent with the statute and with existing case law. So even though we're required to update the guidelines every 2 years, we have specified objectives to guide our update this time. Most importantly, we aim to make the environmental review process more efficient, so an easier process for public agencies to get through, but also more meaningful, meaning that we will get better projects at the end of the process that achieve better environmental outcomes. We're hoping that this guidelines update will also reflect the administration's adopted policy priorities, and those include, among others, taking action to combat climate change, to promote infill development, and others. And finally, of course, as I mentioned, because they're regulations, this update does need to be consistent with statutory changes and cases interpreting CEQA. So I'll say a few words about the process that we've undertaken and how we got to where we are today. As soon as Governor Brown took office, the Office of Planning and Research began a listening tour to try to figure out what different conversations were happening around the state about potential improvements to CEQA. Shortly after, during that year, we engaged with the legislature to get some legislative changes to CEQA, including a provision on streamlining infill development. That provision required that we update the CEQA guidelines to implement that provision. So during that whole time, OPR was taking notes on what potential improvements could be made through the administrative process versus through the legislative process. In the summer of 2013, OPR and the Natural Resources Agency distributed a solicitation for input, broadly asking stakeholders to give us your best ideas for improvement. Having received the input from that solicitation for input, OPR developed a possible list of topics that seemed to be consistent with the cases and statute and with the administration's policy priorities. We published that list in December of 2013, and again invited the public to weigh in as to whether we missed anything or whether those were the appropriate topics. Having reviewed all of that input, we put together this comprehensive, what we're referring to as a comprehensive CEQA guidelines update. You'll notice that we've titled the document a preliminary discussion draft, and we mean that. We expect that this is just a conversation starter. In our experience, the public has weighed in on different efforts that we've made, and we've been able to improve our products as a result, and we expect that to happen here as well. So what's in the package? The document that you'll find on OPR's website, again, we call it a preliminary discussion draft. You'll find it in the CEQA guidelines section of the OPR website, and it contains a number of pieces. First of all, it contains the text of proposed changes, and those changes fall into roughly 3 categories. First, there are a set of efficiency improvements designed to make the process go more smoothly. Next, there's a set of substance improvements, which are designed to get better environmental outcomes. And finally, there's a whole category of technical improvements, cross-references and updates to reflect changes in case law and statute. In addition to the text of the proposed changes, we also have background and explanation that sets forth both the factual and legal background support that we believe supports the changes that we're proposing. And finally, there, sprinkled throughout the document, there are a number of questions for reviewers where we have identified places where we could go multiple ways with the proposal, and we've asked the public to weigh in on what is the best way to go. So let's talk a little bit about some of the specifics in the proposal. In the category of efficiency improvements, we have a couple of changes related to the use of regulatory standards in the CEQA process. The first set of changes would clarify in the section 15064 on determining significance that it's appropriate to use thresholds to help determine the significance of projects. And by thresholds of significance have been recognized in the case law as a relatively easy way to determine whether something may have a significant impact or not. The new changes, though, do follow the guidance that we see in the Communities for a Better Environment decision out of 2002 that clarifies that a threshold of significance is not a safe harbor. It's still subject to the fair argument. So in other words, even if a project doesn't trip a threshold of significance, a lead agency may need to consider a fair argument that it might still have a significant impact. The next set of changes related to regulatory standards falls in the section on thresholds of significance in 15064.7. It states that it may be appropriate for lead agencies to rely on compliance with regulatory standards as a threshold of significance. It also attempts to define what an environmental standard is for use for those purposes. The next set of efficiency improvements involve putting existing environmental review to use for later projects. So first, the changes clarify that the rules on tiering in section 15152, they're specific to the tiering mechanism, but they don't necessarily govern use of program EIRs, master EIRs, or other streamlining mechanisms. Next, the changes propose to clarify what within the scope means for purposes of program EIRs, and it puts further definition on when a later project may be considered within the scope of a program EIR, and therefore additional review would not be needed. Next, we propose a couple of changes to existing exemptions. First, in section 15182, there is a provision for projects that are consistent with specific plans. The current section applies to residential projects that are consistent with the specific plan, but we have proposed some changes to clarify that for projects that are consistent with the specific plan and that are within a half mile of transit, it could apply also not just to residential projects, but also to commercial and mixed-use projects. This reflects a new provision that was added in the Public Resources Code in SB 743. We also propose to alter section 15301 on existing facilities to clarify that even if an existing facility is vacant at the time of project approval, it might still be used, it might still qualify under the existing facilities exemption. In other words, it's appropriate to consider the historic use of that structure. We also propose a couple of changes related to bicycle, pedestrian, and streetscape changes. Perhaps the biggest set of changes that you'll find in the document relate to Appendix G. For those who have been following Appendix G over the years, you'll note that it's grown and grown over the years. Currently, it's at about 89 questions and roughly 15 to 18 categories. We have taken a pretty thorough review of Appendix G to see if it's possible to reduce its size. In other words, to remove redundant questions and to consolidate some questions on related topics. The biggest set of changes that you'll find may be in the category that we're calling open space and working lands. We've updated questions also to be consistent with the case law, and we've also added a couple of new questions related to energy and wildfire, and I'll get to that in just a minute. On energy, on wildfire, the changes were required by SB 1241 from a couple of years ago, and they were developed in consultation with CAL FIRE. You'll also find a couple of placeholder questions in Appendix G related to tribal cultural resources. We are currently working on an update related to tribal cultural resources. Holly Roberson is leading up that effort, so stay tuned on those changes. But what you'll find in this placeholder is just a question that appeared in a draft technical advisory that OPR released this summer. We also have placeholder questions related to transportation analysis. Again, we have a parallel effort going to update the CEQA guidelines to address transportation analysis under SB 743. We will be releasing a revised draft of those changes, hopefully later this fall. Finally, in the category of efficiency improvements, we propose to add a new section, 15234, on what a lead agency should do in response to a remand from a court following CEQA litigation. It clarifies that courts may, in their discretion, allow all of a project or portions of a project to proceed while additional environmental review is undertaken. The language of the remand will, of course, control. The new section also proposes some additional language to help guide lead agencies on the scope of that additional review that might be required. So on to the category of substance improvements. We're proposing two main changes. The first relates to energy impacts analysis. Since the 70s, CEQA has required lead agencies to consider the potential energy impacts of their projects, but the details on how to do that analysis has been contained in Appendix F. As a result, a lot of lead agencies seem to have forgotten what that analysis might require. In recent years, there has been growing litigation around that topic, so we're proposing to add to section 15126.2, the section that deals with significant impacts that need to be addressed in an EIR. We're proposing to add both that and questions to Appendix G to clarify what the analysis of energy impacts must account for. And specifically, lead agencies should account for the energy use over all project phases, including both building and transportation energy. Relevant factors in that analysis might include things like project size, location, and whether the project has incorporated any renewable features into the project design. Finally, we also clarified that this analysis is subject to the rule of reason. The next update related to substance improvements is to water supply analysis. And we're proposing to add to existing section 15155 a new subdivision that codifies the Vineyard decision from several years ago. And this was a decision out of the Supreme Court that set forth the requirements for a water supply analysis. And specifically, it requires that lead agencies consider the pros and cons of the water use that would be demanded by the project, analyze the supply that may be available to that project over all phases of the project's life. It requires that lead agencies acknowledge any uncertainties in supply, and if those supplies couldn't be confidently assured, then the lead agency would need to consider alternative sources, including possibly curtailment in the future. And then finally, there are a whole host of technical improvements. For example, some address the question of what is the appropriate baseline. There have been a number of Supreme Court cases on this issue in recent years. There is a new section on when it's appropriate to defer mitigation details. There have been a whole line of cases addressing that issue. There is some new changes related to when it's appropriate for an agency to provide a general response to comments that come in, particularly late in the comment approval process. And there are many, many others. There are approximately 30 sections of the guidelines that we're proposing some changes to. So let me say a few words about what is not in this package. This package, you'll notice that in our list of possible topics, we suggested maybe addressing greenhouse gas emissions and updating the analysis for greenhouse gas emissions. The Supreme Court currently has several cases in front of it addressing that issue. Because those cases are currently being heard by the Supreme Court, we will not be recommending any changes on those issues. Second, as I mentioned, we have parallel guidelines update processes going right now on AB 52, tribal cultural resources, and on transportation analysis. So do stay tuned for further updates on those topics. So our next steps, the comment period on this package closes on October 12th. We do encourage everyone to submit their written comments to us, preferably by email. We will review all of those comments at the close of the comment period and consider at that point what possible changes to the package might be appropriate. Depending on the scope of those revisions, we may seek additional review if we hear from everyone that the package is perfect, and I encourage that as well. If it's perfect, we may send it directly to the Natural Resources Agency to conduct a formal administrative rulemaking process. We have Heather Baugh with us, so I'll ask her to say a few words about the agency's administrative rulemaking process.
Good morning. It's nice to see everyone in the room, and thank you for being on the webcast. So the guidelines become legally effective once they've gone through the administrative process for rulemaking, which is the regulatory process the state uses to ensure that the regulations are transparent, the least burdensome they can be, and effective. So what will happen is OPR will graciously send us a fully baked and prepared lovely package, which we appreciate. It will come to us. We will initiate the rulemaking process. We will file a formal notice with the Office of Administrative Law on that process, and so the public will have notice. Once the formal package is filed, and there are several documents that will go along with that notice, you'll have 45 days to issue formal written comments. We are required by law to respond to each and every one of those comments, so we will do that and then decide at that point whether we need to do additional work on that package or whether that package is ready to be fully implemented and made effective. So it's helpful for you to comment now because we can take those comments into thoughtful and mindful consideration, but you will certainly have a chance to formally comment through the administrative process as well.
Great, thank you, Heather. As I mentioned at the outset, I do expect that we'll have some additional improvements to make to this package based on public comment. So we do encourage that at this point. I should mention, however, that all update materials are available on OPR's website at www.opr.ca.gov under the CEQA Guidelines tab. So at this point, let's talk a little bit about providing input on the guidelines. We do ask stakeholders to consider limits on time and resources, both yours and ours, and we encourage folks to focus in on the most important issues, although if you catch a typo, please let me know about that as well. Because this needs to go eventually through an administrative rulemaking process, all of the changes need to be supported with both legal and factual support. So it's helpful to us and to the Natural Resources Agency if you recommend changes that you also help us by giving us the legal and factual support on that. I mentioned that we do encourage people to send their comments electronically. We have the email address, the dedicated email address up on the screen. It's ceqa.guidelines@resources.ca.gov. And again, the end of the comment period is October 12th. So at this point, I'd like to ask folks in the room whether they would like to provide any public comment. Would you mind raising your hand if you intend to speak? Okay, we have one person. Since we have one person, and do feel free to also speak up later if you like. I won't limit the time. I'll mention for folks on the webcast, this is an opportunity to send in your formal comments if you want. Also, if you have any clarifying questions, we're happy to answer those as well. The way to provide input via the webcast is again through the CEQA.guidelines at resources.ca.gov website, and we will be monitoring that. With that, I'd like to ask our commenter to come up and provide comments. Yes, please.
And while he's walking up here, I did want to clarify, you can contact Chris or myself or Tom Gibson at the Resources Agency. We're all located on these websites we've provided. So if you'd like to talk offline and you feel more comfortable with that, we just want to let you know that's available as well.
Great. Is it on? Okay, thanks. Good morning. My name is Brian White. I'm with KP Public Affairs here on behalf of the Mosquito and Vector Control Association of California. We appreciate the opportunity to make comments on the CEQA guidelines, proposed CEQA guidelines. We'll make formal written comments as well to respond to the deadline that you mentioned. Just for those of you who don't know, MVCAC, we represent over 65 mosquito and vector control districts in California. Their main priority is to make sure that vector-borne diseases and mosquito control is taken into account for public issues with health. We have a lot of emerging vectors in the state, not only just West Nile virus, but there are some other ones that people have never heard about. So our task is to make sure that the public understands that. And we work with public agencies, work with state and local agencies, and one of our primary partners is the Department of Public Health. So we have a real interest in making sure that whatever guidelines are proposed take into account the potential land use issues that are out there with respect to climate change, development, et cetera. With that in mind, one of our primary tasks is actually in the state code, and it's under the Health and Safety Code. And you mentioned make sure that we provide factual and legal substance for this. So I'll just read to you what our duty is. It's to, we're authorized to protect public health by taking into account any and all necessary or proper actions to abate or control vectors and vector-borne diseases. As such, we're charged legally to abate public nuisance, which is generally defined as any water that is a breeding place for vectors, and any activity that supports the development, attraction, or harborage of vectors, or that facilitates the introduction or spread of vectors. It's generally known that CEQA is intended to inform the public about potential environmental effects on the environment and propose decisions that the government must take into account. So our main concern with not just the CEQA guidelines, but just in general, is that a lot of these developments and potential climate change issues aren't taking into account the potential impacts on vector control and mosquito abatement. We're working with the state water boards to make sure that they understand that with regard to retention basins and stormwater runoff. And so we want to make sure that, as the CEQA guidelines are developed, and we've talked to Mr. Calfee about this, is that our issues are taken into account. We're not exactly sure where to insert it in the particular section, but we would like to make sure that there's some technical advisory or some guidelines that recognize that approach. And so in the end, just summary, we want to make sure that the guidelines going forward include mosquito abatement and the local planning process. We've actually put out a document called the CEQA White Paper. It's available on our website. I think we provided that to you. We'll continue to make copies. We think that's a good local planning tool. Not to say that we don't want it to be some type of litigation type issue. We just want to make sure that people understand when they do these developments that there are other issues, unintended consequences that can happen without considering mosquito and vector control. So that we thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Looks like we've encouraged additional comments, so thank you. Please do come up.
I heard clarifying question come up, so I'm going to take advantage of that. Lon Payne from the California Energy Commission. We have our draft comments ready to go. They're going through internal review, and we will submit them electronically and in a letter before your deadline. But my questions were, do you have any back of envelope estimates of when you think you'll do the handoff to Natural Resources Agency? And for Natural Resources Agency, once that handoff occurs, what's your back of the envelope estimate of how long the admin process will take to get to a decision? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. It relates to timelines. The timelines are extraordinarily difficult to predict with any precision, even back of the envelope. It will depend entirely on the volume of comments that we get in, and both the volume and the substance of those comments. Sometimes these processes do take some time to sort through the comments that come in. Also, once we get the draft over to the resources agency, I'll let Heather estimate what that might be.
Yeah, so once it does make it to resources, it should take us between 1 and 2 months to initiate the rulemaking process. And then, of course, you'll have a 45-day public comment period. There is not an extensive state staff, you might be surprised to hear. So I will be spending time with my colleagues looking at the comments we receive in that formal process and developing responses with them. So it depends on the bulk of those comments, and also, again, depends on the substance. If changes need to be made, we would look at either a 15-day recirculation, or if they're extensive, potentially another 45-day recirculation. So it can take up to 6 months, but I suspect once it's handed off from OPR, it would be about a 2-month turnaround to start that rulemaking. We will announce it on the listserv, so if you're on that listserv, fantastic. If not, we highly encourage you to be on that listserv. I will post it on our website, and I will follow the formal notice process as well. But the listserv really is an efficient way to learn about what we're doing.
Thank you, Heather, for that. In fact, we send out notices of all CEQA guidelines related activities through the CEQA guidelines listserv. So if you haven't already, we do encourage you to sign up from OPR's website. Are there any other people that would wish to speak, to provide any public comments? And it looks like we don't have any questions at this point from folks viewing it through the webcast. So at this point, I'll show you one more slide. It's just resources and additional information. This points to both the existing CEQA statute and guidelines, published cases, and also a link to the Office of Administrative Law's how to participate in the rulemaking process. If you wish to provide comments, that provides some good guidelines for that. So assuming that there are no other comments, I want to thank everyone for showing up to this workshop. And again, all of our contact information is on our website if you have any further questions. So thank you very much.
We will put the PowerPoint on our website for you all too, just to clarify.
The recording of the webcast will also be on our website.